A port in Oman was burning, not metaphorically, not in some vague strategic sense, burning flames at the waterfront, in a Gulf state that was never supposed to look like a battlefield. And while those images were moving across screens, people in Washington were still using the wrong metric to tell themselves the war might be stabilizing. They were talking about a 95% drop in Iranian missile launches as if lower volume meant lower danger. That is not the real story. The real story is that Iran may be entering the phase of the war where it stops using volume to prove capability and starts using restraint to preserve the exact tools that can change the settlement. That is why this moment is so dangerous, because once you see the war that way, almost everything people are saying about de-escalation starts to sound upside down. Fewer launches do not necessarily mean Iran is running out. Fewer launches can also mean Iran is choosing what to save, choosing what to study, choosing what to hold back until the next American mistake makes the next Iranian move strategically decisive. That is the idea at the center of this source text. And I think it is the part most people are still refusing to absorb. Yes, launchers have been destroyed. Yes, Iran has taken enormous damage. Yes, the missile count is down dramatically from the opening phase. But every time officials and television experts start translating that into a story of irreversible degradation, the Iranians answer with a smaller number of heavy, precise, devastating strikes that does not look like a force firing blindly from collapse. It looks like a force becoming more selective, and selective war is often more frightening than loud war. I want to use a framework for this because without one, the whole picture gets buried under disconnected headlines. The framework is reserve doctrine. Reserve doctrine means the most important military fact is not always what a state has used. Sometimes it is what a state has deliberately chosen not to use yet. Once a war reaches a certain point, especially a war that may be moving towards settlement, the side under pressure has to ask a different question. Not how do I answer every strike immediately, but what must I still be able to do if this escalates one more rung? If Karg Island is hit, if Gulf oil infrastructure becomes fair game, if desalination plants move from warning shots to repeated targeting, if the United States stops talking about pressure and starts talking seriously about boots on the ground, if the war stops being about punishment and becomes openly about whether Iran will still be allowed to exist on the old terms, then where last serious capabilities matter more than your television tempo. That is why the drop in launch volume may actually be the most dangerous signal in the whole war. And as the source text makes in the very specific argument, Iran may have already done the loud phase. It may already have used its early salvos in part to exhaust interceptors, force the defenders to burn precious anti-missile inventory, and establish the basic fact that it can hit what it wants to hit. Once that proof is in place, the incentives change. You no longer need to fire in the same patterns. You need to watch. Measure battle damage, study satellite imagery, use drones to assess what worked. Then keep only the most consequential weapons in reserve for threshold moments. That is not weakness. That is curation. And curated force is much harder to read from the outside. This is where the war becomes structurally more dangerous. Because the side looking at the numbers may misread the silence. Washington may convince itself that fighter Iran is a weaker Iran, that another strike on a refinery, another threat against Karg, another show of resolve in the Gulf, another move up the ladder will meet less resistance than before. But what if the quiet is not exhaustion? What if the quiet is reserve doctrine? What if the lower visible tempo is simply the interval before Tehran decides that the next line has been crossed? Then the war is no longer moving toward closure, it is moving toward release. That is the deeper fear running through this source material. And once you see it, the whole map changes. Take the Karg Island question. In ordinary coverage, this gets treated like one more potential target in a long list of targets. That is much too shallow. Karg is not just another facility, it is the core of Iranian oil export capacity. If the United States or Israel hits it in a decisive way, Tehran will not read that as one more punitive strike. It will read that as a decision to go after the economic lungs of the country. And if Iran reads it that way, then the response is unlikely to stay narrow. It will move outward into the Gulf system itself. That means oil depots, loading facilities, shipping routes, insurance assumptions, refining timelines, desalination plants, everything that turns the Gulf from water and geography into a functioning energy order. And that is why the interview keeps returning to the same terrifying point. Iran does not need to launch more missiles than before to make the next phase worse. It needs only to release the capabilities it has been preserving for exactly this kind of threshold event. That is the tree. If Washington holds back and looks for an exit, then the war may end in a way Washington does not like, because endurance itself will have strengthened Tehran's bargaining position. If Washington keeps relying on air and naval punishment alone, then the damage grows, but the strategic problem remains unsolved. More destruction, less clarity, worse endgame. If Washington touches the wrong economic nerve, especially card, the war broadens from state to state punishment into a regional systems attack. And if Washington talks itself into boots on the ground, the whole fantasy collapses into reality. The interview is merciless on this point. No, there are not good boots for this. No, there is not some secret reserve force waiting to repeat 1991. No, the current U.S. military posture is not designed for the kind of ground war people throw around so casually on television. The Army is much smaller than it was decades ago. The Marines are lighter. The battlefield is saturated with drones, surveillance, missiles, and persistent targeting. In the old world, you could do a slow, ponderous buildup, unload equipment, accumulate force, shape the theater, then move. In this world, the enemy sees the buildup while it is happening and begins hitting you before your large war has properly started. That is the second thing Washington still does not seem willing to admit. The problem is not only whether the United States can fight in Iran, the problem is whether it can even assemble the conditions for fighting there without taking massive losses in the act of preparing. And if the answer is no, then the ground option is not a threat. It is an illusion that matters, because illusions create the most dangerous policy errors. If leaders still talk as if all options remain available, they start bargaining with themselves. Maybe the launch count is down because Iran is nearing collapse. Maybe one more strike will break its spine. Maybe ground forces will not be needed because air and naval power can still shape the outcome. Maybe the Gulf states can absorb more shock. Maybe the shipping system can hold. Maybe desalination plants will stay outside the main cycle. Maybe Hezbollah's barrages are noise, not structure. But one by one, the source text breaks those maybes apart. The Gulf states are already seeing things they never expected to see. Burning ports threaten water infrastructure, oil insecurity, and most importantly, a realization that the American military machine that was supposed to protect regional order is pouring its most urgent help toward Israel, not toward the broader regional system. That changes perceptions. Once allies begin asking not whether Washington is strong, but whether Washington is prioritizing them at all, the political architecture starts to crack even before the physical architecture does. This is where the headline stops being the story. The headline says Iran is launching fewer missiles. The deeper story is that Iran may be preserving escalation leverage for the settlement phase. The headline says the United States can still threaten more pressure. The deeper story is that each additional pressure move may shrink the number of exits that still look like victory. The headline says Hezbollah fired 100 rockets. The deeper story is that the regional fronts everyone claimed had been degraded keep proving they are still capable of re-entering the picture exactly when Washington wants the map to simplify. And the headline says maybe there is still an off-ramp. The deeper story is that every day this war continues, the off-ramp gets more expensive because the final arrangement starts to move away from the old American promise and towards something closer to what Iran has been signaling all along. No return to the previous status quo, no return to a Gulf order built around permanent external military pressure, no return to a world where Iran simply absorbs punishment and then re-enters the same architecture that produced the war. That is why reserve doctrine matters so much, because once a state believes the real prize is not merely survival, but the terms of the order that follows survival, holding back becomes rational. You do not spend your most frightening options to win the news cycle. You save them for the moment. The other side proves it still does not understand what kind of war it is in. And that, I think, is the terrifying possibility the source is trying to force people to face. Iran may not be firing less because it has less left. Iran may be firing less because it has decided the next missiles, drones, or system-level attacks must do more than hit a target. They must shape the end of the war. That is a completely different kind of danger. Because a war in that phase is not judged by the daily total on a launch graph. It is judged by thresholds, by trigger points, by what happens if Karg is hit, if Gulf water infrastructure becomes a target set, if shipping remains strategically insecure, if the United States keeps mistaking selection for surrender. And that is why the quiet is so dangerous. Not because nothing is happening, because something is being saved. The terrifying part is not that Iran has already done everything it can. The terrifying part is that it may still be deciding when to stop holding back.